Welcome! My name is Myrna Min and I am graduating as a game designer with interactive narrative design on a side note. During my education I started out as a full game designer, but over the years my interest in storytelling has only grown to such an extent that I now see myself as both equally. During my last project I was mostly busy with mixed reality, theater and interactive narrative design, but not really with games. Although my skills as a game designer contributed greatly to the project, no way could you call our end result a game. So for now, my graduation project, I wanted to go back to those two pillars I identify as, a game designer and a storyteller. My inspiration for my graduation project came from the game Bendy and the Ink Machine. I was always fascinated about the way that game tells its story. You see, the amazing thing is, it tells a true story in a symbolized fictional way. I've been amazed by this way of storytelling ever since I saw the game theory on this game, and I decided I want to try to do that too. For my graduation project, I wanted to design a game in which a true story is told through symbolism in a fictional way. This shouldn't be too obvious and players should be able to discuss and have some struggle figuring out the true story from underneath the fictional layer. From this game, I will pick one part which I will build in Unity as a demo. As the story, I chose the story of an American serial killer named Richard Chase. More on that later. In the story, I want to challenge myself as a narrative designer and tell a complex, emotional and engaging story, which will translate to a true story through symbolism. Besides that, I want the players to struggle in deciphering the true story, which means I need to tell the story in a subtle way, which leaves gaps for the players to fill in for themselves. The story should raise questions and encourage the players to search for a deeper meaning. In the making of the demo, I will use my skills as a game designer with balancing, level design and programming mechanics. My research question for this project is: how do you design and write as a game designer an interactive narrative game in which the player can discuss and question the true meaning of the story? I started out with my repertoires research, where I, of course, first looked deeper into Bendy and the Ink Machine. I had two major questions while analyzing this game. The first one being, how do they tell the story while raising questions on the player's part? Bendy does that in a very clever way and finds balance in how much of the narrative they tell and how much the player has to figure out for themselves. The game gives the player a piece of the story, but the player has to puzzle them together. In Bendy, for example, you have to fight multiple versions of the same character that are created by the Ink Machine. After defeating them, however, some of their bodies melt into a puddle of ink, while other bodies remain intact. This is a small design decision that doesn't seem significant at first, but this is a huge clue in the story about which characters have souls in them and which don't. The game doesn't really tell the player which characters have souls, but with this small clue, players are able to figure it out for themselves. I tried in my game to tell the story in a similar way. You, as the player, starts out not knowing anything. Instead of telling the player who he is and what kind of world he is in, he has to figure it out for himself by connecting the dots in dialogues and world building. For example, when you start in the game, the player doesn't know anything, but little by little he learns more and more. You wake up with someone standing over you, with tinker tools in their hands. You look down and you see your body, which is made from metal. So now the player knows two things. He is some kind of machine, and the man standing over him made him or fixed him in some kind of way. Then the player gets up and immediately breaks his leg. The man standing over him screams angrily at the player and tells him to do his job. The player now knows even more. He is not very well built and he has a job, a function, that involves doing something for his creator. Besides that, the fact that the creator screams angrily at the player after he breaks his leg tells the player the creator could blame him for not functioning well. Little by little, the player knows more, not by being explicitly told to the player, but because the player can draw his own conclusions from what happens in the game. While analyzing Bendy and the Ink Machine, I had also had a second question. How do they translate the true story into the fictional one, without the connection being too obvious for the players? Bendy and the Ink Machine tells the tale of the animation battle between Walt Disney and Fleischer Studios between 1921 and 1942, told from the perspective of Fleischer. The game symbolizes various aspects of the true story, like the ambition of Mark Fleischer, which was to make his characters come to life, or how the studio went bankrupt in the end. Those are and a lot more aspects of the true story are translated into the game in the fictional layer, and this is also what I want to do in my own game. I took certain elements from the true story of Richard Chase, like how he wetted the bed when he was a child, and translated that into a leaking oil tank for the robot. Chase being delusional and constantly thinking he was sick, translated into the player being broken, but nobody was able to fix him. And Chase at some point started drinking the blood of rabbits, which I translated into the game by the player having to take bunny toys and the oil from them to keep his own tank full. These are a few examples, but throughout the story I followed Chase's life and implemented elements of it into the fictional setting. My target audience for this game are experienced PC gamers who have an interest for narrative games and indie games. This target audience is very familiar to me, since myself and a lot of my friends include in the target audience. I have a lot of insight already in this community since I am part of it. My project will succeed when I have a demo level at the end that sparks the interest of more than half of the players and gives them motivation to play the full game when it comes out. I will test this by letting a group of 30 playtesters play the game and afterwards let them fill out a survey. One of the questions will be if they would play the game. If more than 50% answers yes, my goal is achieved. Another success factor of my projects is when the story of the game translated into a real life story with the use of symbolization. This is achieved when I can point out multiple elements of the true story in the fictional story. The elements should be enough to recognize the true story and distinguish it from others. My process started with finding a suiting story for my game. I had few requirements in mind while I was searching the web. The story shouldn't include any racial or political statement. It should have a number of unique aspects which makes it recognizable. It should have some character development and it should have a type of conflict. I decided to focus on the type of conflict that I wanted and go from there, since the conflict is what drives the story forward. I chose the type of conflict between protagonists and, as the antagonist, the self. That means that the player would fight up against himself and he is the one who holds himself back. This type of conflict fascinated me, since it was in my eyes one of the more complex conflicts, and I'm always up for a challenge. I found a lot of suiting stories in the corner of mental health problems, when people would be hallucinating and in that way their mind would hold them back. One of the stories I held as a possible candidate was the story of the killer Son of Sam. I came up with the idea to give separate voices or feelings of the protagonist separate characters who would take the role of antagonists. In the game you would be facing real characters while those symbolize the feelings like desire or anger, and the game all just takes place from within someone's mind. I took that idea further and thought about how the mind would look like as a map, a location, and how the player would receive information from the outside world. In other words, how would Son of Sam have experienced the conversation while hearing voices in his head and feeling all kinds of emotions? And how would that translate to gameplay and a level? Here is where I got kind of stuck. I wanted to follow the source material and be true to the real events and the person that I was literally going to tell the story from within his mind. The point was, Son of Sam heard voices in his head and he thought his neighbor's dogs was the devil. But he did experience the world around him very clearly. Besides that, the story of Son of Sam is pretty well known and therefore I was afraid it would become too obvious. So I took a step back again and took the reasons why I didn't want to use this story and kept looking for a new one. That's when I stumbled upon a paper of a clinical physiology student who researched the serial killer Richard Chase and had a 250 pages on trying to figure out what happened in his mind and what drove him to killing. This was my goldmine. It gave me insight in how aspects from his childhood affected his way of thinking and how combined with his schizophrenia this drove him to insanity and eventually killing. It had some unique elements as well because, well, he cut his victims open after killing them. He drank their blood and then completely decomposed their organs. It had development since he started with small animals, and since he lost more grip on reality when he got older, also killed larger animals and eventually humans. This story was better suiting for my project, and I developed some concepts for gameplay and characters. I also started to make a timeline of his life to have an overview of the interesting elements that I could use. There was something bugging me though. The concept that I had right now, the player would play as Chase himself inside his own minds, with emotions like desire and anger being represented in characters. In the concept, the emotions were the one who would drive Chase to killing, by twisting his perception of reality and convincing him to give in. It's a pretty good symbolization of how he actually perceived it with the voices he heard, but I didn't feel comfortable continuing with it. This structure and way of storytelling created empathy for Chase. On one hand, I like that, because it makes the whole story way more complicated than he killed people so he's a monster. It was way more complicated, and in a way that Chase just didn't receive the help he needed. I thought about all kinds of ways to ask the player the question, what makes us human, and when do we become monsters? Is it even within our own control? On one hand, very interesting, but on the other hand, this man has killed children and decapitated one of them and dumped his body in a box behind a church. Does somebody like that deserve empathy? Does he deserve a chance to be understood, that he wasn't just evil? I don't know. And I was struggling with that a lot. I was thinking of how I could fix this problem and that I could make a game telling his tale within the limits of my own moral compass. I wanted to do that by making the gap between the true story and the fictional story a bit bigger. So when I read a direct quote from Chase in his official statement saying he cut rabbits open because they looked like mechanical toys, I started writing a story doing just that. I kept a structure in which I divided Chase's personality into two characters, one as the character of the player and the other one representing his consciousness with the voices in his head, which was leading him down the wrong path. I came up with a rough concept for the world and the characters and took events from Chase's life and one by one translated them and fitted them into the story. Some as quests, some as characters, some as cutscenes and some as mechanics. When I had an overarching story clear, I wrote out the prologue and the first chapter into further detail, which will be the scene that will serve as the demo. In the demo, you'll be playing a part where you have to fix yourself. Chase was delusional and constantly thought he was sick, and so the robot you play in the game is actually broken, which was Chase's perception. Your friend, who presents Chase's consciousness, brought you as the player to a trash belt, where you two might be able to find some new parts for you, with the help of Somnia, a big robot who sorts the trash. She thinks you'll be able to find the parts you need, but only with the metal that's already sorted out of the trash. The catch is, though, once it's sorted, its weight and everything that goes in must come out. Otherwise the humans will think Somnia is broken because she miscalculated. So now it's up to the player to search the belt with a metal detector and find metal parts and match the weight of the parts that you need. This will be the puzzle the demo revolves around. First, the player explores the trash belt to find the metal parts until he has collected the right ones who together combine in exactly the weights of the parts you need. I started building that scene into Unity. Instead of using the Unity player controller, I built my own controller to be able to have more control over things such as sensitivity and other balanced variables. During this project, I will also receive the help of Randy Paulus, a 3D game artist here at HKU. Since 2 weeks now, we've been working together as he will do the environment art for the demo. This is the only part that he will help around, and he will have no further influence on my project. To be able to see how well the narrative of the demo worked in triggering players' interest, I've had a test with the target audience. I presented the narrative in the demo in a flipbook style video. After people saw the video, they filled out a survey which helped me seeing how well the information was received, how well it was interpreted, and how it triggered interest. It gave me a lot more direction in how the demo worked and how I could improve it and iterate on the demo. Until now, I've mostly been focusing on the narrative part of my project, but now that that's mostly done, I'm starting on the demo. I can focus on the game design of my projects almost fully the coming half of the project. In the coming 2 weeks, I'm aiming to have all the mechanics working in Unity, and then I'll only have to bring them together and balance them. After that, I have to script the dialogues in the demo, which I already found voice actors for. I'm almost certain I will have the puzzle, the dialogues, and the further mechanics working at the end of May. From there on out is going to be the prologue, balancing, and helping Randy with the rest of the art. For the demo, I decided not to work in quantity but in quality, in an iterative workflow, which means I will first build everything in a minimal way and then keep improving on it in newer versions. For my UPD, I'm currently writing a research paper. My research question is, how does a game designer convey the internal conflict of the player character inside a first-person survival game in such a way that it creates an emotional connection between the character and the player? I chose this question because in all AAA games I've played, this has been done in numerous ways, but none of them worked very well in my opinion. Sometimes the player character just talks to himself out loud, but in real life no one really does this, which makes it feel very fake and forced, and there's little emotion well communicated. I've also seen that the player character writes his thoughts down in any form of media which you can find in the world, like letters or diaries. But most of the time emotion doesn't really come across in written words. I want to look deeper into more games to see different methods that are used for this, why they sometimes work and why they don't. I also want to figure out which way I can best use for my own game, since the player character is resembled by Chase and has the internal conflict of killing people. For this paper there will be the following chapters. There will be an introduction, then internal versus external struggle, in which I go a little bit deeper into depth into the different types of struggle and conflict. Then internal struggle of a character in other media, how do books or movies do it, for example, and what can I take away from that? Character building, how does internal conflict contribute to character building? Then agency and interaction, and how do different types of interaction influence how the player experiences struggle or emotions of the player character. And then I want to look into different ways to convey internal struggle of the player's character by reference research. Numerous ways I've already known is talking to himself, dialogues with others, media and the world, such as a diary, or visual communication. I hope to also stumble upon some other methods and more ways that games are doing this. Then I will reflect on the methods and see which method I will use for my own projects and why. Well, that altogether sums up where I am in my project right now and what my plan is moving forward. I've got faith I'll be able to pull it off, but how about you?